Morning, morning, monsters. Happy Monday. So, I have a bit of fun. So, on Thursday/Friday, I was talking about the potential of doing a book club. And that is what we are going to be doing. I'll tweet it out. But the book club, we will talk about a book on the 15th or the first show after the 15th. And the first book we are going to be doing is Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge. It's 2006. It came out. Now, full disclosure, I have read it before, but I haven't read it with an eye to detail and really picking it apart as much. So that is the first book. It's available on audiobook and EPUB and all that jazz, and I do believe there's a DRM-free version floating around because the author's quite a hippie. So it's a very, very light start, and we will talk again about that book, and we will dissect that book on the 15th of Feb, or the first show after the 15th of Feb. And that is well, we'll figure out the details of how we actually do the book clubby part of the discussion. But it's an experiment. We're going to be working through it. We're going to be working about it. But that is what that is going to be there. And inspired by the first book that we are going to do in the book club, because today is not about book club. Today is generally about something else. We are going to talk about how I discovered this book, or more importantly, the person who led me to this book and some of the very interesting things he is doing. The person in question is Ken Perlin. So there is a whole nother video that I want to do at some point on the phenomenon of Perlin noise, one of the first procedural texture algorithms and one of the first sort of procedural noise algorithms that we still use today. It's a hugely powerful bit of math. And that's the thing that Ken's probably the most famous for, is Perlin noise. But he's done a lot of development in computer graphics, computer science, mathematics. But so he's a little bit of a hero. But I had the fortune to be at Develop 2 years ago, I believe it was. Yeah, I believe it was 2 years ago. It might have been 3 years ago, actually. Oof, 3 years ago. Time flies. Anyway, he was at Develop giving a talk because he's US based. He's based in New York. And I hadn't been following Ken's career because, you know of these figures, but you don't really follow them like that. And turns out he was at NYU and he's been at the Media Lab, and he's been working on a project called Chalk Talk. And it's a fascinating thing. And after the talk, which was very good, and we're going to be diving into some little bits about the kind of stuff he's doing, but the whole field, not really specifically his stuff, but that area. But after the talk, I was also a speaker at Develop, and I was just in the lunch line, and we bumped into each other, and we sat down and had one of the most interesting lunchtime conversations I have had in years. The man is very, very interesting, and the thing I found most interesting is, much like me, he is a theatre geek. He's a total drama geek, and so we actually didn't spend the lunch talking so much about technology. We spent most of it talking about theatre, but he's been doing a lot of stuff with the New York theatre scene and VR and AR and technology integrated into shows and stuff, because the whole point of theatre and the illusion of theatre is so readily identifiable with virtual reality and augmented reality. And communication models, because at the time I was working on Sony's, I was wrapping up Sony's R&D project around VR communication. So basically, we just had a lot to talk about in that whole space. What do I mean when I'm talking about future interaction models? Well, if you go back to before the written word was broadly disseminated, we've only really got one form, which is oral tradition and conversation, right? And you've got plays and bits and pieces like that. And it's interesting, you could actually trace a lot of the evolution of that, and how theatre and town criers and everything, dissemination of information and all that, fascinating as you sort of track down that. And then with the introduction of written word, you've got the dime novels and the pamphlets, and it's so interesting to see how much of the printed press technology was driven by pamphleting, and by people basically going, I don't need to make money off this, I just want to get a message out there. And that's actually a very common thread that we've identified in technology. Not just me, Ken identified it, a few other people identified it that I spoke to. So many of the first medium movers in a new type of communication, are non-commercial, because they have some, they have vanity press, like they're just wanting to put out a message there. They're interested in just spreading information, or there's a religious angle or a belief angle, if you will. And so a lot of early printed press and a lot of early plays and theatre were driven by these desires, and it's only later that they became commercial. But then you've got things like the telephone and the television coming out. Now the telephone, fascinating, interesting thing about the telephone, because it's the first time we divorce human speech from the physicality of being there. But it's not like when you write a letter or when you write a pamphlet, it's dead communication, right? There's no reaction to it, but there was sort of a natural separation. Everyone knows the written word is quite far apart from you, but we think of phone calls as quite close, and there was a very interesting split in how body language and voice sort of split up. And there's been some interesting studies around the psychology of that. But I want to fast forward. I want to get to the part that I'm interested in and the part that I'm really good at. But I just want to get the background sort of in place. Television becomes a whole thing. Now, television broadcasts early television broadcasts are largely defined by the fact the camera is static, and the fact that you can't have too much movement in the image, otherwise it just doesn't look good. And so vaudeville had a revival, and a lot of sort of puppet shows and things had a revival where they were live performance, because you had to have cheap live performance that was static, and vaudeville and stage shows did really well for that. And that's where you got a lot of ventriloquist dummies, a lot of stand-up comics weren't really a thing, but a lot of sort of dancers and singers and such. And that changed our opinion of things a bit, because those shows, while they worked initially for television, they aren't well suited for television, because the whole tone of them was for the music hall atmosphere and people clapping along. And if you've ever been in theatre and stage, like being on stage and hearing the audience roar, and even hearing the audience shift in their seats and react is part of the experience, and it informs your performance. So the vaudeville stuff died down a bit, and then we entered this heavily edited period of communication where film starts picking up. And so this defines really, I'd say, the last 50 odd years of our communication, where it's very heavily edited video, lots of close-ups, multi-camera setups, and we become these sort of dispassionate observers. And recently, with Twitch and video chat and FaceTime and everything, we've started bringing visual elements back in. More and more we're communicating with pictures again, which is very natural to humans, like a lot of the abstraction of language we've done, which has been really useful for the development of mathematics and other interesting things. isn't useful and isn't natural to empathy and human communication. So as we sort of get back to FaceTime and live video conversations, this gets a bit more interesting. And as we get into spaces like Twitch, it gets fascinating because you've got this video feed of me, you've got my immediate voice, and while I don't have that for you, I have a sense of the crowd from chat, so to speak. And I've had very interesting conversations with people about how the vibe of a Twitch chat, especially when you talk about larger channels, and I've spoken to streamers and stuff about that, and people have been like, well, how does that actually work, and go through that. And people being on Twitch, you guys are all familiar with that. But sort of fast forward to 6 years ago now, just joining Sony, and VR's a thing, and VR's popping off. And at this time, Ken's been working a lot in the theatre circuit, and he's at the New York University Media Lab, and they're starting to play around with interaction models, and he's been doing a lot of this kind of research area. And there's a few other people sort of tinkering around in this space, and I've glossed over a lot of things like IRC and MUDs and huge text comms and stuff, because we're just glancing over a lot of this bit. But I still remember how that went. I think it was my first month in Sony when basically I get told she wants to know what the communication looks like in VR, and we take our first swing at it. And I'm not talking about anything super NDA'd here, because we actually gave a GDC talk a few years back, and I'll get to that in the story. But we were like, okay, what does communication look like in this virtual world, this augmented world? And that's one of the reasons I want to talk about Rainbow's End, and why Rainbow's End is our book of the month. And we're not going to talk about it today, but we'll talk about it next month. But it tackles a lot of these concepts in a really interesting way, especially considering it's written in 2006. It's really ahead of its time. Another book I was almost tempted to recommend, but it hasn't aged as well, but at some point we might get to it, is Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, if you're interested in VR, is one of those titles that, again, predicted a lot. It predicted a lot of the internet. It predicted a lot of how we interact on the internet, and it posed some really interesting questions around identity and communication on the internet. So we dived into this VR problem, and now, to be clear, we're not the only ones in the space, but we're attacking it from, okay, there's 2 people with VR headsets, what does that look like? Or there's 3 or 4 people, what does that look like with communications? And obviously we're very focused on PlayStation and PSVR and Move controllers and all that, but we look at other platforms as well to see what's happening. And there are things happening around this time. So Old Space and a few other early VR chat stuff is happening, but it's very early days. It's very rough, and a lot of it is driven off things like Second Life and PlayStation Home, which was part of the avatar boom, which is a whole nother talk I could go into. The avatar boom, which caused things like Microsoft Bob and all kinds of really interesting, fascinating things. But anyway, we're focusing down on communication in the future. And there's some immediate things that come to mind when you deal with VR, as it currently is and probably will be for the near future. The first one is you have a very high quality microphone, and you'll have very high quality audio. So not only do you have better audio than a phone call, because the mic is always positioned perfectly because of how the headset sits. The VR mic, the microphone on PSVR is just amazing. But then you have this very high fidelity audio, and it's spatialized, and when you turn your head, and so you can have like 4 people talking to you and you can pay attention. So that immediately, the audio aspect, the audio bandwidth is superior to phone calls, even superior to a headset setup. Like now, if you're listening to me on Twitch on headphones, you can't turn to the side and mute me as you sort of listen to someone next to you and stuff. So immediately the audio aspect we shoot up. So audio is huge win. Great. Okay, audio sorted. So we know we can talk. And we know we can specialize audio, and we know we can do crowds, and we did a lot of investigation into network traffic solutions that I won't go into, where there's a lot of complex problems about processing multiple audio feeds and keeping bandwidth low and handing off, and anyway, did a bunch of stuff around that. And so, okay, we've got audio. Audio is really solid. What's the next thing? Well, what about as you move? And it's like, well, the only thing we can really track is your head and your hands. And we can't track your fingers unless we're playing around with like an Oculus Touch. And even then, there's limited finger tracking. It's not really great. So what can we do? And the first thing we noticed is just the way you move your head and the way you move your hands tells us so much. So before we even got avatar customization into the prototype, we could identify who the person was by how they moved. It was mind-blowing that as long as your sample rate was high enough, and we played around with this where we actually downsampled and we introduced noise into players' movement. So we would introduce a bit of noise into the recording of the gyroscopes, or we would sample at like 1 second intervals and things like that. And we did a bunch of experiments about how that quality of motion degrades and at what point it becomes unrecognizable and stuff. And it turns out you need a relatively high sample rate, not super high, but relatively high, and a relatively good precision of movement to get that sense of feel of a person. The moment you lose the personality. And that was like, it's an obvious thing, but that was a lot of interesting numbers around that. And then we did this whole system about, well, how do I express, because you can't see my face, right? And even if we had a webcam and we did like experiments with a webcam and we did like trying to do lip tracking and things like that, we were like, there's so much, like, if you could pick between like how to shield the face, right? If you could do this or this or this, the thing you'd want to do is probably this. And ironically, we did some studies around that, and there's a lot of distrust when a person hides half their face like this. When you do this, you can understand what the person's saying better because there's a lot of lip reading cues, even if you're not deaf. And there's some great experiments in VR, by the way, and around sound, where there's some words that if I play the exact same sound, but I had two different lip movements, like I showed you 2 video files that have the exact same sound, but one has lip movements that are slightly different to the other, you will hear a different word when you're watching either of these videos. So the first thing we realize is like, okay, you've got these 2 things, and this gives you a lot of audio thing, but we already have quite strong audio cues. And yeah, there's some things like smiles and stuff, but actually eye tracking and and sort of forehead and facial and brow movements, that's where so much of the expression was. So even if we shove a camera on you, we're losing a lot of that because your headset's obscuring that. And we're like, okay, can't do that. Well, so how do we abstract, or how do we make that synthetic? And so we did actually, and it actually ended up leading to a software patent, which is filed and's out there, around using hand gestures from button combos, so things like thumbs up and thumbs down and thumbs up and pointing and peace sign and a few others, rock and whatnot. And then based on how those were gestured, so like 2 thumbs up or whatever, you grin and you and then you're like and you know, we interpret from your hand gestures, we infer facial expressions. And that helped a lot. That was a system that was really natural for people, and people really got. But we were very focused on the physicality of the space. And when we looked at things like, because we looked at text entry, and text entry is a no-go, an absolute no-go. Probably the best thing for sort of what we called abstract command, like abstract commands or shell commands, we sometimes call them. So like, let's say you're in VR and you're talking to your friend, but you want to tell the computer to sit you down, or you want to tell the computer to play an emote, or you want to tell the computer to adjust volume or whatever. The solution we came up with there was to push a button, hold a button, talk, and then rely on voice command stuff, like with Google Home and all that jazz, to implement. So we had that whole solid base, and as I say, that we did a GDC talk on that. Our team, our Sony team, did a GDC talk on that back in, this is 4 years ago. 4 years ago at GDC. It's before PSVR came out. It was really funny actually, because there were teams in that audience that completely 180'd based on our research. And I know one particular team that was working on a pool game, and it was called something else. It was called like Pool VR or whatever. And after watching our talk, they went back and they changed their entire game. So when they launched, they called themselves Sports Bar VR. And they'd rejigged the whole thing around player communication. And I've spoken to like the VR chat guys and a few other people who pulled from our research, because it was a really great time where everyone was really being open about the research, and everyone was sharing about what does the future of communication look like. And I haven't even touched into the mobile area, because there's a whole bunch of mobile comms around there, and there's a whole bunch of sort of gestural recognition stuff. But this brings us to Ken and Chalk Talk and the stuff he was doing. He had a different remit to us, and he was doing things like he was taking kids and he was shoving them in AR and VR headsets, but he was putting them in a shared space, local area network. So his bandwidth was through the roof, and he could even, with lighthouses and stuff, track everyone in the same space as they moved through the same space. And so two people could high five, and they'd actually high five in reality as well as in VR, because they were tracked. And he did some fascinating things around there. But he also did a lot of abstraction of communication. So Chalk Talk is like, you can draw things, symbolic things, on a chalkboard, like not in VR, and it'll simulate like a pendulum and things like that. And you could do things like write out a maths equation, and it would OCR the maths equation and solve it. And Ken was taking some of that into AR and VR, and we had some very interesting conversations around that. But yeah, so the whole communication aspect and what VR comms does for the future of communication and interaction is very interesting. And I haven't even got into bits like when you start looking at so at the moment, if we want to have a conversation about a model, now if me and you are sitting across in a cafe and we have a pen and paper, we can doodle on a napkin, right? And that's been a thing humans have done for a very long time. But doodling on a napkin is great, but it's very 2D, and it's very limited. And well, now then you say to someone, well, here's some Play-Doh, and if you go into a lot of creative spaces and a lot of game studios, there'll be Lego and there'll be Play-Doh in the meeting rooms, because sometimes you want to just sort of communicate a space, and it's much quicker just to sort of shove down some Lego or get some Play-Doh or whatever and represent the thing. And in VR, you have both. You can sort of sketch out a thing, but you can then also sort of spatialize a concept, and you can rotate it, and you can bring that around. And then if your VR communication simulation has physics, well, then there's a whole other thing, right? So now, if the two of you are in VR and you're talking about a pendulum, and you put a pendulum there and you swing it, it swings, and you can go through that. And yeah, if you happen to have a creative tool that has a lot of this stuff, and you can put VR and networking into it, you can do some really cool stuff. And the concept that was first coined in Snow Crash, and something that I've been passionate about for a very long time, it's actually the basis of Quake initially, and the basis of a lot of computer science people have chased this dream, and it's called the metaverse. And that is what we're talking about, is this. The metaverse is so important because not only is it the internet, but it is human communication, and it's another reality laid atop our world. And that's what I'm talking about when I say the future of interactions. I'm talking about the metaverse. And as much as I enjoy some things like Sword Art Online and Ready Player One, they're not actually inspiring books because they don't really dive into what does new communication look like. Not what does our everyday communication look like here, transported to VR. But when we started writing things down, that changed how we dealt with language. When we started using phones and text and everything, it augments and limits language in different ways. And as we go to VR and as we go to these virtual spaces, it's another translation of the human experience. And it brings with it a lot of power and potency. And Snow Crash expressed that really well. It has aged, which is why we're not going to read it. But Rainbow's End plays around XR, AR, VR concepts. And I strongly encourage you to join us on the read of it and dig into it. But I wanted to just go through and talk about some of Ken's work, some of my work, why this book just hit hard, and give you that background that this is a really solid and interesting conceptual book in which to tackle some of this stuff. And I just wanted to share my passion for this particular topic. And I have been chasing the metaverse came up in my interview at Sony, and I have been the metaverse is what brought me. That's what got me into VR very early on with DK1, and it's what got me into the space. And let's just say I've been pursuing that really hard, that dream of the metaverse really hard. And there's key components to it, and we'll speak about it in the future at some time in other slices. It's such a big topic. It's too big for one morning. And I haven't even discussed the importance of persistence in virtual spaces. Persistence in virtual spaces is really interesting. And again, covered in all of these. But for those of you watching on YouTube, this is a live show, and we record it, and we're going to do a Q&A now on live show. But you missed that, I'm afraid, because we're going to just go straight to Twitch now. So come join us on Twitch. Otherwise, ta-ta for now, and see you next time.